Hi, this is your host Sapil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Maneesh Dhir, CEO of Pepperdata. Manish, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, and since this is the first time we're talking to each other, and you're also CEO of the company, so I would love to know a bit about the company. Tell us, what is Pepperdata all about?
Sure. So we're based in the Bay Area, like many companies of our kind, and we've been around for a while. But really, what we're all about, in a nutshell, is if you're a company that has either moved to the cloud or is moving to the cloud and has big data workloads of any kind, and you are faced with the challenge of runaway costs, we help you provide what we call autonomous optimization, the ability to optimize your workload. So it brings down the amount of resources you consume and therefore the cost you expend. And we sort of augment that autonomous optimization with some very robust tools for comprehensive enterprise class monitoring, right? Which incidentally are sort of a companion or built on Prometheus, which is a very popular sort of monitoring tool especially in the Kubernetes open source community.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, an overview of the company. You talked about monitoring. I also want to understand a bit about when we do look at uh, Kubernetes environment, or these words are interchangeable, cloud native and Kubernetes, they are kind of becoming synonymous. Uh, can you talk about the importance of monitoring in this word? Also, when we talk about monitoring, let's just forget about these terms because we talk about observability, tracing, monitoring. Let's look at the bigger picture, that what is the ultimate goal? To have visibility into what is going on in your system so you can either optimize it with performance, security. So talk about it from that perspective.
Sure, sure. And actually, maybe if you don't mind, I'll take a step back also, because first, let's talk a little bit about Kubernetes, right? The world is moving to Kubernetes, right? In fact, we did a survey about this time last year of about 600 organizations. And some of the data that, and this survey is publicly available, is that about 77% of the companies we surveyed, sort of enterprises, said they are in the process of or have moved to Kubernetes. And roughly 50% of their workloads in 2021 had been migrated. So Kubernetes is clearly a destination for the vast majority of businesses that are moving to the cloud. Right? That's sort of premise one. Right? Premise two is, along with it comes a culture where DevOps is the name of the game. CI/CD is the key process most organizations follow. So what is DevOps, right? For your users, even though I suspect this is a term that they're quite familiar with, is that the boundary between development and operations is relatively blurry. The developers are involved in the deployment of apps, in the real-time modification of it, and to make them performant and cost-effective, right? And so in this process, the role of monitoring for both the developer and the operations person is two or threefold. One, to make sure that in an environment which could be, especially this is one of the benefits of Kubernetes, could be on-prem, could be hybrid, could be multi-cloud, right? The app is performant. The app is, it is behaving in line with the business case that was made to move things to the cloud, right? Because often a digital transformation comes with it an expectation of a certain set of benefits, one of which is the flexibility and the cost structure that the cloud allows us. But often when companies move to the cloud, they find that their experience can be a little bit different. Initially, the costs are higher. And more importantly, month on month, they often see them going up. And there's what we call bill shock, right? And so monitoring has two objectives. One is the basic objective of monitoring, which is to make sure things are running okay and the app is performant and so on and so forth. But increasingly so, the role of monitoring is to understand what resources are being consumed and whether, as nodes are commissioned, decommissioned, right, that the behavior is in a way that is cost effective, right? And so that's the lens through which monitoring, or now as we call it, observability, is increasingly being used by organizations, especially the larger enterprise.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that overview. One more thing I want to just go a step further when we talk about observability. Um, Knowing what's going on is fine, but without actionability, it's just logs. You just know. So can you also talk a bit about that? It could be from Pepperdata's perspective as well, to actually help DevOps teams to be able to do something about it as well.
Good question. So our journey with this started with, as I said, observability, because our customers, and our customers, to give you just a flavor, generally tend to be Fortune 1000. A few of them are actually Fortune 10, some are Fortune 100. So relatively large enterprises for whom this problem was at some significant scale, right? And they wanted to be able to observe key metrics. They wanted to be able to retain them for long periods of time so that they could examine the behavior of their infrastructure and be able to adjust it. And that journey then eventually took us to where we are today, which is you start with observability, but eventually what you realize is, but just by monitoring a lot of statistics, because in this world of the cloud, there's a profusion of metrics. You can instrument just about anything at any frequency. So it's very easy to end up with thousands or even tens of thousands of readings. It's trying to make sense of that becomes the next challenge. And most IT organizations, especially DevOps organizations today, they have many challenges, but having sufficient manpower, having sufficiently trained manpower, and then having just sheer hours in the day are some real challenges. So we started to be giving out recommendations from our monitoring and observability platform. And then we realized that actually people don't have the time to look at those recommendations. And that's when we sort of moved to where we are today, which is we built something called autonomous optimization, where those recommendations, instead of giving them to you, the IT ops person or the DevOps person or the architect, call it what you will, we ingest them. We see which resources are being commissioned but underutilized. And we then automatically, behind the scenes, with no intervention from you, we adjust those resources dynamically. So they go up and down based on the real life usage of those resources. And our customers tend to save about 30-40% of their resource consumption, which is then directly reflected in sort of their cloud bill if they're on the cloud.
I want to go back to the point of DevOps a bit. If you look at the traditional IT landscape, or private clouds, there used to be silos where there were teams or professionals who knew about that particular thing. They were responsible, that whether it's networking, security, whatever it was, they knew and they would take care of that. With cloud, as you also said, what happens is you just go to any big provider, put your credit card, and get their service. Now, how much attention developers can pay to a lot of things which are really important. Security could be one, optimization could be one. That's number one. Number two is that because of the DevOps movement, earlier developers, your job is just to write application which adds business value, and your job is done. Someone else will run it, someone else will secure it. Now everything is in your pipeline, so you have to manage so many things, which also means the complexity is growing.
Yes.
The area of expertise that you need may be lacking. Plus, there is a shortage of skills as well. So first of all, how do you, when I say you, Pepperdata, look at this problem? And once again, as you talked about autonomous optimization, so let's talk about what's the problem here, which you see in general from broader perspective, and how you folks actually help teams, whether the company is big, as you mentioned, or small, so they are efficient.
Again, I think this is a very emblematic of a real life situation. most organizations, big or small, are going through this. See, often this is, let's start from the beginning. Why do companies move to the cloud? Because the cloud is flexible. Premise is you can have more dynamicity in your resource allocation, and hence you can save in the long run costs. So when the mandate comes from, often in a company there may be an executive. Sometimes they could have a role as a chief digital transformation officer or something like that. The mandate to move to the cloud comes. The first thing is to move the cloud to be, move the application to be cloud ready or cloud enabled, right? Often that could be lift and shift, as we call it in the industry, which is you take it, you make minor modifications, but you don't necessarily optimize it, right? If you have the luxury to do so, some organizations actually will build fresh organizations from the stack, which is why going back to where we started, the rise of Kubernetes, it's sort of what we call the modern data stack. That's where companies want to be because it's resilient, it's performant, and it allows you that flexibility to pick your environment or a mix of environments. But once a developer has built the application, and usually the reality is that most projects tend to run over budget over time. That's just the way things are, right? That there isn't enough time to optimize the application. And even if you are able to optimize the application, when you are running the application, often again, you find that what the application is consuming versus what you thought it should be consuming, there's a big gap. And that's where we come in. We do not necessarily count on the developer to have gone through all these steps. We look at the dynamic behavior of the application. How is it actually running with the workload that you've chosen? Let's say it's a big data workload. Let's say it's running as a batch process on Spark on a platform like Kubernetes. You may have allocated a certain amount of resources. Let's call that resource memory. You might have allocated, say, 5 GB of memory, but for the most of the time, you're actually using maybe 2 GB of memory. Well, if I knew that I have that extra memory available, I could actually run another job. But the scheduler doesn't know that, right? The scheduler doesn't have the smarts, if you will, to figure that out. So what Pepperdata does is to actually look at, it goes beyond kind of what the developer can do, right? It looks at what is happening in real time. And based on that, it adjusts the workload that is being deployed for the resources that are being commissioned. And if you have more resources commissioned than are actually needed because there's no backlog of pending jobs, it'll actually throttle back the resource usage. That's how you get the savings that I spoke of.
I mean, if you look at Kubernetes, it has, Prometheus there, which helps with monitoring, knowing what's going on. So talk about, not just the limitation of Prometheus in the sense, but as we were talking earlier about the developers or DevOps, their own limitation that comes from the complexity. So talk about that, since it's already there, where Pepperdata actually jumps in to help folks make things easier and simplify them. So once again, they can focus on business value, not get intimidated with all the metrics and data.
Absolutely. And at the onset, I want to just recognize that Prometheus out of the gate is a great way to get started, right? It has several advantages, and time permitting, I'd go into them. But I think just for brevity, let's just state that as at the onset. And focusing on really what you asked, which is, so if I'm on Prometheus, where lie the gaps, right? The gaps lie in one, it's sort of making it enterprise grade, right? If you're an enterprise, you want to look at patterns and metrics over long periods of time. The genesis of Prometheus is more for real-time monitoring. And real-time monitoring is very valuable, but it doesn't necessarily take away the requirement to have long-term monitoring because workloads change over time, consumption changes over periods of time. Enterprise organizations want to retain that data and examine that data over longer periods of time. So that's one aspect that we can do that doesn't come built in. The second is, in this environment, it's Prometheus has a fairly rich querying capability. It has a real-time database, so it allows you to sort of be able to instrument and pull in a lot of metrics in real time fairly quickly and efficiently. But what it doesn't have is the ability to do complex combinations of metrics, business metrics, system metrics. It also, in a Kubernetes kind of environment where resources are being commissioned and decommissioned. So a lot of ephemeral services, if you will, or requests or node addresses are coming and going. The ability to grab that, so you get the best view of your application's behavior, that is a little bit of the shortcoming of Prometheus, if you will. And thirdly, it is about putting all of that together in an enterprise class dashboard where you can look at all of this, you can make sense of the trends, and then take action, right? A lot of people use tools like Grafana, for example, to supplement Prometheus. Again, for you, that may be a good solution. But if you're a larger organization, what we call enterprise, you want things like role-based access control, you want to have more complicated sort of combinations of metrics. And by the way, you want, if your job is a bad job, you want the capability to be able to look at not just the basic metrics, but for Spark specifically, you want to be able to look at the more complex metrics, the more multi-stage executor metrics, which is where Prometheus often doesn't give you what you need. But those are the areas where companies like Pepperdata, with a strong foundation in observability, that's where we come in.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for explaining that. I will go to the very beginning when you're talking about a survey was kind of done. I'm pretty sure that by now the numbers are much higher than what
Yes.
folks were saying about adopting Kubernetes. But Kubernetes, sometimes I compare it with the Linux kernel as well, because when the Linux toolbar came out, he did not expect where it will be used. Now everything is running on Linux kernel. Same is similarly happening with Kubernetes as well. You can also call it Linux of the cloud in a way. As the use case is growing, we and not only use case, but where it's being used. Edge is also there. So can you also talk a bit about where do you see things are heading, and what kind of challenges will it create for monitoring? As you talk about, cost is becoming a big factor. There was recently an open source project called Open Cost, which is specifically for Kubernetes, cost as well. So talk about from that perspective as well, where you see things are heading, and how the ecosystem in terms of company like Pepperdata will evolve to tackle some of those problems.
Sure. We think about this a lot because we're one of the early companies to be in this autonomous optimization space. And I think you're absolutely right. One, cost sensitivity is the order of the day. We're now in an economic environment where, frankly, that's being mandated. If you're the CFO of an organization and you look at your cloud bill, often there is a mandate to say, look, let's compare the business case to kind of where we are today. And often there may be a big gap on that. So I think all applications, on one hand, the move to the cloud isn't going away. I think the fundamental benefits, the premise behind the move to the cloud stays strong, as you mentioned. And there are different forms of computing paradigms emerging, edge computing being one of them. But I think fundamentally, what the industry needs as a foundation is the ability to look and monitor. In the traditional era where you had a Linux kind of environment, you had tools which did sort of system management, right? Where you could instrument everything and look at that. That level of enterprise grade monitoring, if you will, has to be prevalent, not just to make apps performant, but also to make sure that you're getting the best use of the resources that you're deploying, not just in the cloud, not just in the edge, or with workloads like, typically it's not just big data workloads. There are so many different workloads now moving to the cloud. The ability to manage all those workloads and understand their characteristics and be able to then address any sort of gap between expectations and reality, that really is where I think the industry is. So I see monitoring certainly as a baseline capability, but the ability to optimize that consumption of resources, that waste that is being generated, I think that's sort of the need of the hour. That's what our customers are telling us.
Manish, thank you so much for taking time out today and join me to not only talk about the company, but also share, the larger picture in terms of observability and monitoring, and also where things are moving and how folks like Pepperdata are helping users. So thanks for sharing those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Swapnil, pleasure was mine. Thank you too.